Hi everyone, Rachel Boucher here from Event Marketer Magazine. I'm so excited to guest moderate this live edition of Cramer's Pivot Points, a podcast featuring today's most innovative leaders in business, marketing, and live events. And yes, we're coming to you today from Cramer's very own in-house broadcast studio. Thanks for sharing it with me. So a quick setup on our topic, which is event branding. In the world of corporate events and brand-hosted events, marketers often struggle to build synergy between the event's own goals and message and the organization's overall branding and corporate message. This is something the team at Medidata concentrates on in planning their events. And so we're going to talk through some best practices and how they applied this thinking at their flagship user experience Next New York last November. So joining us today, we have Trip Underwood, Vice President of Content and Strategy at Cramer.
Hi.
Hello. We have Devin Littlefield, Managing Partner at Market Vantage.
Welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And tuning in, we have Jennifer Plumer, Senior Vice President, Head of Marketing at Medidata Solutions. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Hey, Jennifer.
All right, so let's get right into it. Why does event branding often fall out of sync with the organization's overall branding, and what are the ramifications of that? Let's just talk broadly first. So Jennifer, I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, so a lot of times with events, you have multiple stakeholders that are working on the event itself and the branding. And so, that can be the event marketers, the branding teams. You may be having the geo teams implementing these events as well, on top of outside agencies or designers. And so as everybody's working on these separately, even with the best of intentions, sometimes it can lead to misalignment on that branding. Also, as your business is growing, there can be changes that are happening with the brand, how you're positioning some of your product portfolio. And those booth assets that you have sitting in storage may have some of the more outdated branding. And you can also run into budget issues where the events team or the geo teams are not wanting to reskin all of that with these branding changes. And so lots of different factors at play there, but certainly it is something that is critical to have that alignment between branding and then how you're showing up at events, especially considering how much budget is put into event presence. So I'll stop there. I'll pass it over to Trip.
Well, I think you make an interesting comment. So to your answer to your question, silos, and I don't think it's just an event marketing thing. It's a problem in business writ large. But I think Jennifer makes a great point that it's not just communication silos, but budget silos as well. As a third-party vendor that deals with this, I see a lot of, well, who's going to pay for that? If we have to have this, excuse me, microphone. Who's going to, whose budget does that come out of? And anytime you attach a dollar amount to things, it suddenly elevates. So I think, to Jennifer's point, this idea of communication across teams is important, but also understanding the ramifications financially of who's in charge of what and who gets to make what decision can kind of create a little bit of tension within organizations.
Yeah. Devin?
Yeah, I guess I'll add to that one thing we see, especially in that branding element, is, my world, especially in advertising and on the financial side, just making sure that they are tying together well with the strategies that you're implementing on the ad side. Branding needs to be very consistent and coherent throughout, especially as you're trying to drive potential attendees or even just in experience as well. So it's going to be really important to make sure that your brand is consistent, as well as you can really just help make that case that this is going to be an important thing throughout the entire experience.
And if I could caveat one more thing, which is I think it's interesting, you have a bunch of marketing and event professionals. We didn't talk about the audience yet. It's confusing for the audience. So there's all these ramifications internally that our teams are dealing with. Let's not forget the people at home that are so used to seeing a specific style of branding in the world, either through advertising or however they are targeted, and then you walk into this big, beautiful ballroom, and it looks completely different from what you're seeing in the wild, and that's confusing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's all an experience, right? You even walking in the building at Cramer here, one thing that I love, it's like touching the magic, right? You get to see it, you feel it, and it's all just part. No, I swear you did not. It's just all part of the experience, and it all lends itself together. And so it's coming in with that branding and that key messaging that how do you want to actually tie this all together, and how is this how is this going to get executed? And I think, again, that's just a really important point to think throughout this entire process as you're thinking about your branding for the event, or even as far down as how your ads look.
I think about that long-term, what they're left with, that lasting impression.
Right.
And so if there isn't that synergy, then it only kind of feels short-term, because whatever they experienced at the event and whatever that look and feel was, or that message, doesn't really carry through to the long term, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Jennifer.
Yeah, and for marketers, you've probably had somebody come up internally and say, well, nobody's going to even notice that it's the wrong color or the wrong logo or outdated messaging. And you're right. Like, you may not have a customer walk up to the booth and specifically notice that, but it's what you have on your booth from messaging, the visual identity. It's either going to help reinforce, even as subliminally, what you're trying to accomplish with your branding and that messaging, or it is going to detract from what you're trying to accomplish. So having all of that be cohesive, whether that's at the event presence, to the website, to social media, so on and so forth, is really important, and something that we need to be good brand ambassadors and stewards of, to ensure that everything is going together.
Yeah, and Jennifer, clearly strong alignment, right, between in-market global branding and event branding matters to your team and Medidata. Let's talk about how that approach came to life with Next and the work in planning and marketing that show. And maybe first you can tell us a little bit about Next itself.
Yeah, so Medidata Next is our owned event series that we operate globally. So for this year, we're going to have 9 different Next events. Some in North America, some in APAC, and some in EMEA. And Next New York is our flagship event of all of those 9. And so, about a year and a half ago at this point, I approached the Cramer team, and we wanted to take a look at how we were doing next. And it was a good opportunity to take a look at our strategy, what our approach was moving forward. And so a lot of that work helped influence our series last year. And a big piece of that is how our identity comes through with that event. Because if you're taking the time and the budget to put on your own event series, you really want to make sure that it's working hard for you. And that's through the messaging as well. And so when you have multiple events happening across all of these geos, you're not going to have one central person or one central team working on every piece across that. And so ensuring that you have that consistent strategy that first starts with setting your objectives, so everyone is on the same page about what you're trying to accomplish with this series. And that ultimately helps each of the regions and each of the stakeholders that are involved make decisions that are going to align with your overall objectives.
Right. And to Jennifer's point, from the event perspective, that strategy and that consistent look that exists on paper and within the strategy is so important, because when you do start going to different locations, there's things you can't control. When you're designing a digital ad, for instance, it's the same size regardless of what cell phone you're using, what computer you're using. You get to a ballroom that has completely different dimensions. It can really affect how things look. So doing whatever you can to make sure that the visuals and the messaging is consistent is going to go a long way for creating that consistent experience if there is any overlap in attendees, and even if not, you're just looking for that overall brand consistency.
Yeah, and especially afterwards as well. I think one thing that Medidata does impeccably well after Next is then take advantage of that content and build a website experience around it. So then people after the event get to go to the webpage, they're going to see all the videos, they're going to get to align with the content that they want to watch, right, based on the different themes of the event. It all plays together nicely, and that is all what I would consider still part of the experience, right? You're now taking the people that either came to the event and getting to relive a little bit of it, or people that maybe they weren't able to attend the event for whatever reason, but they're going to still get to understand and feel part of that experience. And that consistency is just as important, post-event, with how you activate your content or how you're going to market with that content after the fact.
And it almost becomes a unifying moment then, that the digital piece to it can be your unifying moment, where all of this can kind of make, and wherever you are, if it's a series, it all comes together in that, space.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's one other piece, I think all of us have mentioned the word consistency or cohesiveness. And so sometimes team members that are working on a project may feel that they don't have as much creative flexibility or freedom when, they're having to work from the same playbook or from the same templates. But it's good to encourage the teams just to think about it a little differently, because within an event, there are so many different areas where you can exercise that creative freedom. And, we need to think through things differently and how we want to approach swag or, some of the experiences at the event. But the overall branding is one of the things that you don't have to recreate for each event. Like if you have this system and these templates, that frees the team up to focus on these other things. And so, that's the way that I like to frame it out for team members, so that they're not looking at it as a negative by having to utilize the templates and the branding.
Yeah, and Jennifer, let's talk about those other things, right? Because we do talk a lot about visuals and signage and the color. But, aligning event and enterprise branding is about way more than visual consistency. So just walk us through some of the other elements of Next and how you created those connected experiences in the content and brought it back to the overall sort of brand positioning and market messaging without speaking specifically about branding and visuals. Yeah, about visuals.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So messaging, of course, is a huge component of an event. More than branding, you have a ton of content that is through the keynotes, the breakouts, the roundtables, even the words that your customers are hearing from the customer-facing teams. And so ensuring that everyone is speaking that same language and reinforcing those messages, I think it's a very common metric that marketers have heard many times, like somebody has to hear something 7 times before it sticks. But if that messaging keeps changing each time that they hear it, it's not going to stick in the way that you want it to. So, even if it seems repetitive, like continuing to hammer home, like those key messages are important. So, what you can do as an event marketer, again, start with the objectives. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? Like, that's where you're going to set forth like some of those priorities or key messages, and then developing out what some of those key messages are a little bit further. And then those need to be pulled into your keynotes, down to your breakouts, down to your roundtables. So, while things may be modified a little bit throughout that process, you have that connected red thread throughout, so people can understand like how all of it fits together.
It's what's in a name. It's that, we talk about theming at Cramer a lot, and sometimes the theming of an event, sometimes for some companies, not for Medidata, it can feel a bit of an afterthought, because it's like, well, we'll call it Elevate and we'll all get there. But, to Jennifer's point, if you're iterating the theme, lining it back to objectives and hitting that enough that it sinks in with the audience, you have to be doing it, to her point, repetitively. That, as marketers, I think sometimes we see the big picture and we say, well, we've done it enough, and you're not thinking necessarily from the audience perspective of, I've outlined it that they'll hear it 7 times, but that requires them to be in all 7 places that I've aligned, which really might not be the case. So to be safe, you have to be saying it 17 times in different ways. So having that kind of overarching messaging that is both clear, it has, a good understanding of value of what it's going to be for the attendee, and then thinking of different ways to bring it to life is really important.
Yeah, and I'll add too that Jennifer, I think something you said that was really poignant is objectives, right? The objectives, as long as it's well communicated and everybody understands them, we're fundamentally going to be able to have that leeway to do what we need to do, but we're still staying within the bounds of what we're trying to shoot for and driving that event attendance or that clear experience all the way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I've seen time and time again is, you have an event and your different stakeholders, everybody wants to get their messages in. And so you have an event trying to be all things to all people and hit on every single product, every single differentiator, and it's too much. And so, it goes back to that objective. Like if you know that your objective is X, Y, and Z, well, the messages that you choose to put into the event need to align with X, Y, and Z. So again, setting those, it gives you a reason to push back on stakeholders and say, well, this is what we said that we wanted to accomplish with the event. And, while this piece, is great, let's see if we can use it in a different way outside of this event.
Yeah. Let's talk about where we can take some risks. So there are some instances where brands messaging needs to take a back seat. Where are some ways that you can try that and try some things that are sort of outside of the box?
Within events specifically?
Yeah.
So I think what I've seen, and I think Medidata did a great job at Next, is this idea of thinking about the experience first and then being conscious about how you tie in the message, but maybe not being a slave to the message, if you will. So you do have to think that people are taking time out of their day, perhaps spending money to travel to come to your event. You do need to provide some type of entertaining and engagement that's more about them and secondary to the message. So I do think if an events team has a really great idea for an activation or an experience that they know is going to do a great job at the event, to explore that as much, and someone says, well, it doesn't really align with this or that. I think that's fine. I think people need to have those conversations, but there is a way to shoehorn messaging, if you will, around a great experience, because ultimately we want our audience to leave the event going, that was great. I feel more connected to that brand. I had a good time being there. So I think while messaging is important, it should drive everything. It shouldn't be the sole decider in things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what will be interesting too is as entities are thinking about that messaging, what is the messaging pre-event, during the event, and post-event, right? And how can you leverage that content and that core message in different ways? I think that's going to be a really fundamental thing for enterprises especially to think about, because this event is going to be more than just the physical presence of being online or being in person, but you'll be able to take this, if you plan well and do a good job with it, right, you'll take it and use it in some special way afterwards. And that messaging will need to be different than perhaps something that you say at the event or even beforehand. Yeah. So it's really important to be thinking about that messaging from the different lenses of how that content, especially afterwards, will get used.
Yeah. Does that resonate with you, Jennifer? Yeah.
It sure does. And, two things that I'll add is one, like if we're having Next New York as our flagship event, that's probably not the time where we want to test out something completely brand new. So, what we may do instead is use something that is existing, plus couple it with some newer things as well, so it feels fresh without it being a radical departure. But also, we have, for us with Next, we have this entire series, which allows us to do some A/B testing on some of these different variables with messaging between the different events. Or, if you don't have your own event series, test out new approaches with some of your smaller events where there maybe not as much of an investment or as much risk. So that's the way that I like to think about it. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. Like, you can do this incrementally.
Yeah. Okay, so much of event marketers' planning processes have been shaken up over the last few years, whether it's tighter timelines or newer or evolving audiences to market to. So let's talk about what the roadmap for a program looks like today.
So I think it has changed and it hasn't changed, which is a long way to say that post-pandemic, I think budgets are being impacted in different ways. I think travel is being thought about different ways. I think there's people that are reimagining what their ROI in an event means. So that's all happening on the internal end. That's all the things that people like Jennifer and I care about. But then when you get to the idea of trying to reach the people that you want to go to your event, they're also being marketed at differently now than they were before. So I think having a strong go-to-market strategy for reaching out and attracting potential NTs should remain relatively the same. Look at what you've done in the past years, continue to do what works, tweak what isn't. Like, that's nothing new under the sun. But I would recommend, and especially what I've seen in the past year or two, is casting a wider net. If you rely heavily on social media, as so many of us do, to reach an audience, the algorithms are changing all the time. So what I thought worked last year isn't working this year per se, and I might not necessarily know why. So it's the idea of do your research, figure out how that is changing, partner with people that can help you do that if you're not smart enough to do it yourself like me. And then also just like be willing to A, B, D, C, E, F, G test. You know, that idea, if you already have a strong theme and a strong strategy and hopefully a strong creative team, you should be able to iterate on some things to see what's meeting.
So what you're saying is don't burn the playbook.
Don't burn the playbook. Make the playbook longer. And if someone is creating the playbook like you, maybe pay them more money. But ultimately, it's like take what works and then just really try to think through it through the lens of modern marketing, especially as it relates to social media.
Yeah, and that's where I think more of the roadmap needs to include that testing, right? The A/B all the way down to Z testing. We're trying to, actually, let me step back. We have data that we are able to leverage. And so we needed to take that data and feed it back to the team and understand message A didn't work, message B worked well. So let's double down on that. We have that capability to be able to do that now. And so much of that requires thoughtful pre-planning before the event, and certainly even before the event goes live in the market afterwards. So that's one really critical piece that I think a lot of companies need to think about. And setting up a strategy to come back to that data all the time and be able to look at the data and just continue to be refreshing messaging, creative, the content itself based on what the data is telling them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. Don't throw out your playbook yet. We saw that the registration was peaking around the same time as it did in previous years during the pandemic and even before. The agenda release peaked registration as well. So there were a lot of things that are still very similar. But as we've all seen within marketing, not just within the event space over the last 3 years, is that attention spans are even shorter. So some of the types of communication, and especially long form communication, aren't going to work the way that they used to. And so finding ways to be more creative, more compelling, more concise with your communications and across multiple different channels has worked well for us.
Yeah, and I think I'll add that especially coming in with a plan around what you want to test and then iterating on that test really quickly. Like if you change this video and include this call to action within the first 6 seconds, does that change from this other video, right? How can you actually see some data play out and support what to do? So I think that's a great point, Jennifer, especially you just need to run tests, right? You need to be able to see what's working and then let that help adjust the playbook.
Yeah.
And I think that change that you just mentioned is a small iterative change, because you think about companies that are spending a lot of their advertising budget on a video and they don't want to hear the video isn't working, but maybe the call to action at the end of the video is what's working. It's finding ways to change what you can within time and budget. So you're continuing to test and iterate with, again, throwing that baby out with the bathwater, just like I said about the playbook.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and Jennifer, you mentioned the agenda, so let's talk a little bit about that. And we all know the agenda becomes a critical marketing tool to drive registrations, right? So Jennifer, what's the program philosophy for Next? What role does the marketing team play in helping to design the program?
Yeah, so it's a beast to design an agenda for anybody that has gone through that process before. And to have a truly great agenda, it does need to be collaborative across many different stakeholders, like within the product organization, within multiple marketing areas, with your executive leadership team, and also with customer facing teams like sales, to ensure that it's going to meet the needs of customers, and also to help generate more business. And so when you have that many different stakeholders and that many different opinions, it can be overwhelming to create what that agenda looks like. But again, I'm going to keep going back to the same point. Setting those objectives are going to help you figure out where you need to focus your agenda, and make sure that you're not trying to cover too much within the time that you have. Um, and then once you have those objectives, figuring out like how much time you want on the main stage and for breakouts, and then honing in on what some of those key messages are for each of those areas. For us, like I like to start with our keynote main stage presentation, because that is that jumping off point that sets the stage for the other keynotes as well as the breakouts. And so once you have that abstract and some of that messaging done, pulling that through.
So we'll take some questions in just a moment. So if you have any you haven't submitted, go for it. But I want everyone to kind of weigh in on a closing question here. And it's, if you could say one thing to an event professional imaging their programming for 2023, what would you say? And Trip, maybe we'll start with you.
I'm going to go back and repeat myself, but I think it's this idea of this is a great opportunity to look at what's worked in the past and then tweak things and change things and take a few risks. I think as the market gets bigger, we're in a boom right now. Events came back in a big way. I think the numbers are much bigger than anybody anticipated, at least bigger than I thought. So I think that the pearl clutching about whether or not these are ever going to come back, what do we do, that can be weighed to the wayside, but that introduces this new problem of how do we stand out. So I think this idea of looking back at what you've done in the past and making sure there's a consistency there, but challenge yourself now to try to think of new and innovative ways to reach your audience and make sure they're having the best possible time when they're at their event matters more now than ever, because they're interested, they're being advertised to, and their travel budgets are shrinking. So it's just getting tougher to engage them.
Yeah.
I think for me, thinking about that playbook in 2023, event marketers need to be thinking about their pre and post event experiences and how they're going to tie that into the main event, especially what your promotional plan is up front, how you're going to activate the content afterwards. That all really ties together nicely. And I think marketers have a great opportunity to think thoughtfully about that. Who's the audience that you want to get there beforehand, but also, how are we going to modify some of this content to speak to the different audience afterwards, or potentially different? That's what I think is really critically important, is pulling those pieces together in part of the plan to make sure you're thinking about that plan cohesively. And it does tie back exactly to what you said, Jennifer, which is what's your objective and how is that getting communicated across your event team and your promotional team, whatever. That's really important to think about.
Yeah, Jennifer?
Yes, my top piece of advice, probably thinking I'm going to say have objectives, but I'm not. I'm going to give you guys something different. Have a flexible and agile mindset. And here is why. Like we've talked about, a lot of things have changed. Attention spans are shorter. Like with this economic environment, your budgets may be tighter. With inflation, your dollar may not go as far. But instead of looking at that, like a challenge, like think about it as an opportunity, because for event marketers that have that flexible and agile mindset and are able to say, you know what, like, let's just find a different way to approach this, you're going to go a lot further, and you're going to be seen, as a hero for being able to adapt to these changing environments, and you'll go a lot further in your career.
Yeah, love that. Great advice. All right, let's get to some questions. And Trip, I'm going to kick this first one to you. Any advice for persuading C-suite speakers to make sure branding brand messaging is appropriately represented in event speeches, I can see some of my senior members not wanting to feel obligated to include it.
Okay, so if I'm reading this right, it's I've suggested this, and the person that I'm working with on the keynote sits way above me on the corporate ladder chain, and they're not necessarily taking the advice that I'm giving, which is totally understandable.
Shocker.
Yeah, exactly. I've seen it before. Couple of different ways to approach this. I think reminding them, kind of as I did earlier, was like, let's think about the audience, Mr. or Mrs. C-suite person. I understand what you're saying is truly important, but I really want to make sure that the audience hears what you're trying to say, and they need to hear things a number of times. So, I think reminding them that why it may seem obvious to them how the brand messaging is connected to their messaging, the people in the audience may not be as brilliant as you, C-suite person. So I think doing that is very helpful. I also think reminding people of the business value of that. Jennifer mentioned it earlier that type of consistency isn't just a nice to have, it really is a business imperative, especially if you're doing an external event that's tied to business goals. So I think subtly reminding them that aligning business messaging with the messaging they have on stage is going to create a sense of confidence and consistency in the audience, who is their potential customer, is going to lead to more sales. That kind of stuff I think works well.
Yeah. All right, for Jennifer, what key questions did you ask stakeholders to help align goals during the event planning process?
Yeah, one of the big ones is what is your priority for your line of business or your area of the business? And, what are the challenges that you're facing? And so, you ask everybody that, and you start to uncover what some of the key areas are where you need to focus. And normally there are some commonalities across, what you're hearing from those stakeholders, and what those commonalities are definitely the things that are likely to bubble up to your agenda level.
Yeah.
And I have one.
And if I can just add on one thing
Yeah.
to the last thing too, when you're thinking about your CEOs and those key messages, sometimes it's easy to put forward a lot of different messages to your CEO. But regardless of who it is that you're putting it in front of, if it's a lot, they're not going to remember all of it. So if you can focus in on, 1, 2, 3 key items that you really want them to touch on, the more likely it is that will happen.
And then I had a question for Devin regarding metrics, because you were very helpful for both Cramer and Medidata in terms of looking at specific success metrics when it comes to advertising and driving acquisitions for attendance, and then using that to inform decisions. So if you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah. It all ties back again to those objectives. What are we trying to actually accomplish with this content? And especially, whether attendance up front or post-event, with how your video's being engaged, when you're hosting it on a landing page. It's really important to think through all the different elements that could impact that engagement, measure it, and then look for the key data points that will help inform some future decision-making process. So as an example, one thing we saw, or a great thing that we did notice, was that people on a certain length of page, they wouldn't scroll down much further, and they're missing some content below the fold. And so that was a great learning, right? Next year, we're going to develop a page that has fewer videos on it. That's a simple way to kind of look at the data, see what it's telling us, and then make an informed decision in the future about it. And that, I can't necessarily sit here and say you need to look at this metric, this metric, this metric, but it's more so taking that holistic approach and having a measurement plan up front, measuring, evaluating what you're seeing, and then using the key data points to help make a decision in the future. And that was something I think Medidata especially did a great job with, going from next 2021 to 2022, was looking at the data and really taking it to heart and then making informed decisions about it for 2022.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that a little bit and say, we have this plethora of data now. And it's easy to report out on all of the data like time on page or the bounce rate. But what's really important is not those individual data points itself, but the so what? Like, what are the insights, and how are you going to use those insights to impact what you do in the next year?
Right. I mean, I'll even add, like, if I see a video that it's a 10-minute long video, it's getting a 70% completion rate, let's say, that looks like a good metric on paper. But if it's still not driving to the objective of driving new pipeline, as an example, so what? Like, that may not impact us. But if we see that even this one video over here has shorter engagement metrics, but people actually filled out a form and got in touch and started a conversation with a sales team, as an example, way more important. So exactly to what Jennifer said, it's the so what, right? Like, metrics are one thing. It's about crafting the metrics in a way that creates a compelling story that we can then use for insights and action down the road.
Make it actionable.
Yeah. Okay, question from Jesse. Thank you. Do you have any creative ways for a vendor to help general managers and/or directors of sales beyond the vendor service itself?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Do you mind reading it again? This is what happens when you go live.
All right, Jesse, we're going to try this again.
Sorry, Jesse.
Do you have any creative ways for a vendor to help general managers or directors of sales beyond the vendor service itself?
I'll take a stab at it.
Please.
I think what it comes down to is what Tripp said earlier, is the why, right? Understanding what value this is going to bring to be involved or part of this process, because ultimately every department has objectives about what they're trying to accomplish. It comes from the top down. We know the company needs to drive X revenue, and sales is responsible for Y of that portion, right? So now they are a stakeholder in this process. It behooves them to be involved in the event planning, the pre and post event process at that example company. It really, again, it just comes back down to that why and the objectives in that process. I think, Jesse, especially you have an opportunity to help explain some of how these functions also work and like what the potential outcomes are. And I think you'll still somebody like that in getting involved.
Yeah. And Jesse, let us know if we answered your question. All right. Jay in the audience, what should an agency do when the event design doesn't align with the brand design due to the client not being ready with communication and branding? How can you kind of effectively deal with a situation where your timeline isn't quite being met?
Timeline is so. I think ultimately is how can you be a partner to the client, right? I think that's who's paying the bill. So our job as the agency is to help guide them in a way, help them make decisions that seem strategic and thoughtful, but also not try to force them to do something because it lines up with your terms of best practice. So I have a lot of different clients in a lot of different industries, and there's certain best practices that really speak across the board to everyone, but everyone is different. So again, not sure if I'm understanding the question correctly, but I think to my thoughts, it's this idea of pose thoughtful questions to your clients. Make sure you explain to them why you're asking and the benefit of asking. It's not just I'm trying to CYA or be difficult, but this idea of, if I'm hearing you correctly, do this and not why, and then helping them understand the value of doing so, because hopefully they can go back to their larger stakeholders. Jennifer is one of my direct clients, but there are people way beyond that in her ecosystem that she needs to answer to. So we have that kind of rapport of helping each other. So she has the information she needs to make decisions confidently, I hope, Jennifer, when she talks to her bosses and people further up the ladder from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Tripp and the team have done exceptionally well is just that, because one of the things I value in an agency partner is somebody that is going to push us and bring us ideas and things that are a little outside of the box. And sometimes we take those, and sometimes we're we say, no, it's really not going to work for, whatever reason, because it's an internal stakeholder, know your business and your stakeholders better. So finding that partnership where you have the best of both worlds, I think is important. And, I've certainly worked with agencies before where, it's kind of like, nope, this is what we're going to do. It's our way or the highway. And, that's just never a productive way of working.
Yeah, and I think one other point I'll add on is just really understanding the value of the person you're working with. It's really important, even, I don't want to go so far as saying like a personality type and understanding them, but somebody may really want a lot of communication in the process, and others may just say, take care of it, I trust you to do the right thing. So it's having that understanding, that mutual contract up front to say, like, how are we going to engage? How can I best work with you, partner with you to get the job done? I think that's really important.
But from the agency side, it's then adjusting to this. So we have an interesting dynamic of agency to Jennifer, of agency to Cramer, that we're kind of walking all sides of the fence there.
Exactly.
Let's get to a question I have, because it's come up a couple of times throughout our chat, especially more at the beginning, but it's about kind of creating and unifying, organizations. So merging the marketing events team isn't an option at my organization. Do you have any advice for increasing collaborations between departments? And Jennifer, I'll kick this one to you if you don't mind.
Yeah, so breaking down silos is really important here, and it's something that I always work with any team to do, like, first and foremost. And secondly, ensuring that those working relationships are strong and productive, and for both sides to understand, like, hey, we're not trying to tell you this is the branding you have to use just to be really rigid and to push that down. But come to the table, kind of like we've been talking about, with some of our sales stakeholders, but we need to do the same thing with marketing. So for the branding team to say, here's where we're coming from, here's how we can help with your needs. And for the event team to say the same back to the branding team, like, here's where we're coming from, the challenges that we're facing. And the second thing I'll say is, I think it's really important for the teams to empower stakeholders as well. So if we know that we're going to have, a number of different events in the year, understand, like, what all of the different team members are wanting to do, and then put things in place, like create booth assets that are flexible, that can meet those needs while still being within the branding guidelines. So, that event toolkit or asset library can really work well to empower while still keeping within the branding guidelines.
And I think there's a lot of value in creating, it goes back to the strategy, but having a simple strategy, strategic brief, creative brief, what have you, but having something that it can clearly articulate the objectives of the event that can be shared, maybe not physically, I like hard copies, but at least something you can email around, because it is very simple for certain teams to have a lot of meetings about something, and then someone maybe fire off one email to somebody else, and like, you don't really get the overall strategy. Why does this matter? I get why the event team cares so much about it. But if you can clearly articulate very quickly why we're doing this and why it matters to each particular division, I think that goes a lot way in getting more early stakeholder buy-in from everybody in an organization. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would even potentially want to tie that with regular communications, even just 15-minute check-in meetings, like, hey, here's how we're doing, here's what needs to go on, you're responsible for this, you're responsible for that, all right, break. Yeah, I think that type of even informal communication can be really impactful for teams to just understand that why.
All right, we'll take our final question here. In my organization, we tend to focus more on developing event visuals because of the emotional impact and sense they evoke. How can messaging play a similar role?
I would go back to a little bit what I just said is clear articulation of an objective. This idea of why are we here as an organization and why does that matter to our attendees? Where do those two objectives meet? That's where your message is. keeping it clear and concise, I think, is important. And depending on your audience and what type of organization you are, but trying to make that emotionally evocative in some way. You don't need to hit people over the head with things. Not everything needs to be this grand, like solve the world's problems or constantly elevate for the future. But I think just being aware of what your audience cares about and why they're coming, making that message consistent and trying to make it emotionally evocative so it can support those visuals is very important. Shouldn't be an afterthought.
Yeah. Devin?
Yeah, I'll add that I think something Jennifer said was really important is that you don't just want to test whole new messaging with no baseline. Mm-hmm. You really need to have some tried and true messaging that you've seen results with and sprinkle in some new stuff. So I think that's where you need to find a balance in running, I'll call it thoughtful tests, but effectively you need to see and prove out some of your messaging, certainly before you get to the point of creating visuals. And you could do that with, your website, your social, your advertising, just trying to see what really evokes that emotion, right? Is it the value of the time that you're going to save, or, the resources, any other benefits that you may be able to provide, or is it the strong rah-rah branding? Like, you need to test some of that out in other channels and see what's working before you go and fully brand and visualize your event content.
And words are free. People forget that.
Yes.
Write it down. And I'm not Dickens. I don't get paid by the word. So I'm more than happy to provide, as a copywriter, a bunch of different options and see how that sparks conversations. I think that's a great way to think about it when you're trying to come up with messaging or theming of, like, it doesn't cost anything, guys.
Yeah.
Blank white page, just go for it.
Yeah. Thoughtful testing to add to the roadmap. Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
And if there is a strong focus on visuals and not as much on messaging, one of the ways that you can think about positioning it to your internal stakeholders is that you want your messaging and your visuals to be complementary. Like, you don't want to have these bold images, but then really passive or weak messaging. And so, that would then put more emphasis on needing to develop this bolder or more confident messaging, or vice versa. If your visuals are a little understated, like, you don't want to have messaging that is bold and over the top. So the more that those are have purity, the better it's going to be received.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, I think we can all agree that more and more event marketers are kind of having to flip back and forth between the event professional hat and the experienced designer hat. I think if you've got a creative itch to scratch, this is the time to do it, right? So a lot to think about from this conversation with Medidata. Thank you, Jennifer. A lot of new opportunities on the horizon, too. That's what I've pulled from this, which is great. And that concludes our Pivot Points Live. Again, Rachel Boucher from Event Marketer, guest moderator today. Thank you so much for having me. This is kind of fun. We should do this more often.
We should do this more often.
Absolutely.
And a big thank you to Trip, Devin, and of course, Jennifer for the terrific insights. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks so much for having me. Next time I'll be in person with you guys.
Yeah, nice to hear.
All right. Well, this entire chat, of course, will be available on demand afterward. And for information on Cramer and the Pivot Points podcast, visit Cramer.com. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.